Good afternoon, everyone. I am Michael Steelman, Director of Alumni Career Management and Professional Networks at William & Mary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, Making Your Experiences Relevant. Today's webinar is part of a new William & Mary webinar series and is made possible by the support of the William & Mary Alumni Association. As we seek to provide relevant programming for our lifelong commitment to our alumni, we welcome any feedback and ideas to make this a valuable resource for you. Today's presentation is being recorded, and I will notify registrants once the recording is available. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. It is important to note that if you are experiencing any audio or video difficulties, to please call the Adobe Connect technical support number at 1-800-422-3623. Also, questions are welcome throughout today's presentation. Our presenter will answer as many questions as time will allow. Please submit your questions by typing in the box on the right side of the screen. Throughout the webinar, I will monitor the questions and share them with our presenter at the end of his presentation. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our presenter this afternoon. Daniel Sheres is a leadership and executive coach focusing on supporting emerging and senior leaders in transition. He specializes in helping them to secure new roles and succeed in positions of higher responsibility. His expertise has been leveraged at top management consulting and professional services firms and across many industries including emergency management, healthcare, pharmaceutical, defense, legal, and telecommunications. He has coached and advised senior leadership at organizations ranging from small entrepreneurial ventures to global consulting firms. Daniel is a proud alumnus of William & Mary, and we are truly delighted to have Daniel join us this afternoon to share his advice with the William & Mary tribe. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. In part, my love for William & Mary, and in part, for the opportunity to share a topic that has become increasingly important in my career and transition coaching engagements, and perhaps something that goes overlooked in most professional development activities. As I announced on LinkedIn earlier, this is perhaps the inner work of professional development, and I'm pleased to share these ideas with you today. So at some point, and this is a summary, at some point your professional career path will require that you develop the ability to speak to your talents and capacities in creative and compelling ways, and that's what this presentation is really about. First, though, we have to look at the inner narrative, and that means developing a capacity to extract meaning and metaphorical value. And then, of course, there's practice. So we're operating from one assumption, and that is that the people we respect most from a credibility standpoint are speaking from experience and not necessarily borrowing language. This means that they have found a way to speak to their experiences in a way as to make them relevant. And you can start to see how important this is as you begin or are engaging in professional development activities such as writing a resume, rewriting a resume, writing a cover letter, presenting, or learning how to interview. What I've found, having coached people at the beginning of their career and at later stages in transition, is that this process is relevant. So whether you're going for your first job or you're going for your next one, you will have to somehow engage this process. You'll find that it's actually the quality of the experience that you have, not the quantity, and your capacity to look at it with new eyes. So just as Indiana Jones said, it's not the years, it's the miles. And as you'll see, it's not even just the miles. We're really talking about what kind of miles. Were they city, highway? What did you notice along the way? Did you notice anything? And can you refine your perceptive abilities so that you can dive deeper into your experiences and discover within them creativity, discover within them portability, and a translation process that will allow what you've done to inform what you can do. Ultimately, the irony here is that it's not about experience at all. You don't actually develop experience. Your experience either informs your capacity or it does not. So it's not about what you've done. It's about how what you've done cultivates within you qualities, capacities, and competencies necessary to achieve your objective. This, by the way, is what I mean by relevance. I do not mean whether or not you have skills that the market needs. And I was very purposeful in stating the title, Making Your Experiences Relevant, as the effort that's required. So why is a leadership coach talking about this? Well, in my mind, leadership is doing something new. So if it's been done before, it's management. But everybody who's attempting something new, launching a new product, attempting a transition, trying to secure their new job, their first job, for example, those are all expressions of leadership. And so in order to succeed in that new role, we must be able to translate what we've done. And this is why I put so much focus on this in the career coaching engagements. When I started, I had to go through a similar process. I decided that I would actually look for what's common among leaders. And I found that one of the qualities listed below is that they're compelling. And so I was sort of required to dive into what that actually means. And I think we can all agree on some level that compelling people are more likely speaking from experience than they are quoting somebody or borrowing wisdom. What I've found is that success is not predicted by where you went to college or the degree you obtained or the number of years of experience. Success really comes to those who've mastered this process. Whether they are aware of it or not is actually neither here nor there. Those people that can translate what they've done, find meaning and value in what they've done, and then translate it over to relevance in a new position, those are the people that we find are successful and naturally recession-proof. I've just given you a glimpse into the process that we're going to go deeper into later. Notice that I'm not asking how are successful people different. Instead, I'm asking what do they have in common. And there's a secret here that we'll dive into in a few minutes. So the objectives for today are to learn a process by which we can see our experiences as more meaningful, more informative, and more relevant to achieving our professional objectives. And then two, to adopt a process, a personal practice for discovering the language that resonates with us, and why that's important, of course. So this notion of standing out from the crowd has become increasingly important. We'll talk a little bit about resume writing and this kind of thing in a few minutes. But for now, recognize that a lot of what has to happen in an interview, in an application, is for you to sound different, look different, somehow be intriguing. And I think that the best way to do that, as you'll find, is to mine your experiences and discover your own language. So your uniqueness really lies in your unique set of experiences. And you may only be competing with somebody in title. So it becomes increasingly important to look beneath the label, as you'll see, and discover what those experiences mean to you and how you can better articulate the value of them. So this also means that at some point you'll actually have to practice speaking from experience. This is not necessarily the inclination. The inclination is really more to quote the so-called experts or people we see as mentors and masters. And I think on some level that's really valuable, but some effort has to be placed in defining for ourselves, reinventing the wheel, so to speak, and how we talk about the value of our experiences and not just borrowing the language of others. So it becomes a little bit like storytelling or impromptu speaking about our own lives. So this I thought would be fun to share with you. I'm not going to harp too much on this. This was the path that I followed. It started at the bottom left. I was a graduate of the geology department at William & Mary, and my first job was to evaluate drainage in colonial Williamsburg around highway development. And I want you to look at the arrows that you'll see each arrow represents a transition. These are all of the titles that I've had. Now, the thing about this is to notice that each one of these transitions required the process that I'm describing. In some way, I had to sell somebody on the idea that I could do this next role, or in some cases, let my experience speak for itself. For some of these, it may not be much of a mental leap for you, but for others, it is. And so part of the value in doing this process, and I've done it myself, is to be able to state clearly and honestly what being a geologist did for me, and how, for example, having been a geologist informs me today as a leadership coach. On the surface, these are completely unrelated activities. However, with a little bit of mining, with a little bit of creativity, with a little bit of introspection, you can find the analogies we're actually looking for. So they don't necessarily seem like separate pathways or separate activities, but they seem relevant. So every transition requires a way of seeing our past experiences as important. Developing a language set that would enable me to speak to the value of my experience is then the next step. So not just looking into my experiences, but finding new and creative ways to articulate the value and how they inform my capacities. So relevance in this sense is much deeper. It offers us a sense of meaning. If we don't feel we're capable, that we discover that we are. It reminds us that our experiences, that it's impossible not to grow a little from our experiences, and ones that may seem mundane, or experiences we've had that may have a headline that speaks to a lack of importance, we can actually discover that we did grow, how we changed, and how our experiences inform us. And finally, there's a sense of belonging in the sense that we're all part of this process. We're all part of this growth process, and each experience, if we have a capacity to perceive into them, can offer a lot of meaning and a lot of value. So two people walk into a lecture, one gets a lot out of it, one doesn't. This is equally applicable for those in transition, whatever your transition looks like, to your first job, to a new job, or promotion. And you'll see a little bit more clearly here. One of the consulting projects I'm working on in talent management, the company has used this language, firefighter to fire chief. Now, this company has nothing to do with fires. These are metaphors. So what does it actually take to move from a firefighter to a fire chief? One of the things we'll talk about in a few minutes is a paradox, this idea that, well, to get experience, you have to have it. What if you have no experience as a fire chief? What if you can't actually claim experience in that role? Well, the transition must involve expressing chief-like qualities, right? So in your fighter role, or let's say it's an analyst role and you're looking to move to management, in your analyst role, you will have to discover ways of becoming manager-like, even though the experience isn't necessarily perfectly relevant or perfect match. So this is true if you're moving from unemployed to employed, from your current role to whatever. So I thought at this time it would be fun to have a little poll here and just see, Michael, if you don't mind sliding this poll over, what do you see as the primary determinant of success? It'll take just a minute to answer. No, it's fascinating. Looks like we're heavily weighted to how you know what you've done. Okay, and just 1 or 2 votes for credential and credibility. Okay, so this is very interesting. I think you'll find as a result of this discussion that it's really all of those things in some way. And the idea, if I can relay it, is that the notion of making these experiences relevant in such a way that we can articulate value in the context of a resume, written word, or in personal presentation, that we can actually unite all of these things and discover a deeper meaning. So there are a few principles I'd like to discuss. One of my first clients was a Harvard Law School grad who did wealth management. Her professional objective was to be the executive director of a dance company. She served on the board for some time and had her eye on this position. She felt she was unqualified for it. Now, how is that possible? Well, she's looking at the labels. She's looking on one side at wealth manager and on the other side at executive director of an arts company. So if you look on that level, of course, that's true. In the same way, becoming a fire chief from being a firefighter is true. No, you don't have direct experience. So it may require that you actually look beneath the label and discover, for example, what's not so obvious. If you dig deeper and you start to look, for example, at the skills you develop in wealth management and look at how the role of an executive director of an arts company is similar, for example, in fundraising and understanding funding in that way, all of a sudden you find these avenues which can be used then to sell yourself. So I think in some cases it's just about digging deeper into the experiences for meaning, getting past the title. An example from my own life is I was a technical manager of a project to build a database for emergency operations centers during Hurricane Katrina. If I looked at that role as only the title technical manager, it would be fairly limited in the value that it offers. However, when I dig deeper into that experience, there's really a lot of gold. One of the things I learned, for example, is as a team of 30-some people was put together overnight, literally, and we worked together for 2 weeks, 16-hour days. I actually learned a lot about conflict resolution because as the manager, my job was to sift through very, very smart opinions, very, very well-advised and well-experienced people, and actually come up with a solution. So while that doesn't empower me to walk around and say I'm an expert in conflict resolution, the reality is that's something I learned there. And nobody can tell me otherwise. It's my story. Principle number 2 is more fundamental to what it's like to be a human today, and that's this notion of balancing diversity with unity. We are all well trained at seeing the differences between things, so it is very easy for me to identify the differences between the role of wealth manager and executive director. However, that's only one side of the equation. And one way of thinking about it is like cognitive balancing. What about what's common? And for most people, this is a stretch. However, if you stretch in this direction, what you find is confidence. What you find is assuredness. What you find is a compelling presentation. Through practice, you develop an ability to see commonality, analogy, and this is what makes what we've done automatically more relevant. A funny example in daily life is we often ask children, friends, what's wrong? Wouldn't it be interesting to ask what's right? Wouldn't it be interesting to actually balance that equation in daily life and actually look for the other side, stretch our intellect in that direction? So here's an inquiry for you, and we'll take just a moment. I'd like you to think of a professional objective. It could be anything. It could be a role, it could be a specific job, it could be a financial target. Take a moment and think of your professional objective. And try asking yourself this question. How has my experience prepared me perfectly for this? Or how am I perfectly qualified? And notice what happens. How has my experience prepared me perfectly for this? Now, I'm being very intentional about the use of the word perfectly. Questions like this are designed to stretch the mind into discovering things about ourselves and our experiences that may not be completely obvious. We may be over-focused on the difficulty. We may be over-focused on the differences. By challenging ourselves to ask with questions like this, we can discover alternative viewpoints and in the process discover confidence. I think successful people have a way of looking what they've done as relevant and useful, and I think in some cases it requires that you look beneath the label. They don't see their time as wasted. I've played a number of roles and I've made some pretty significant transitions in my professional career, and there was a time at which I thought one didn't apply to the other. And it wasn't until engaging a process like this that I saw that they did. Not only were they related, but they could actually empower me to a greater level of success. So it's really about a fresh look at experience. And for fun, let's just look at what experience actually means in the context of a paradox, a dilemma, and an opportunity. The paradox I've mentioned, and you're probably already familiar with it, this notion that you can't get experience without having experience. Well, it feels like something we're familiar with, and yet people are promoted all the time. People get jobs that they haven't had all the time. And so on some level, we have to dispel the notion. The second idea is that it's a dilemma that presents itself to talent managers and hiring managers everywhere. What people don't realize when they make the assumption that experience is automatically valuable is that it translates to capacity, that 20 years is better than 15 years. And the reality is, why? How, in what case, is 2 years of experience better than 1 year of experience? And how, as talent managers and hiring managers, can we look into the value of what you've done? For example, 2 people have different levels of experience and can come to the same level of capacity and competence. So how, as hiring managers, can we dig past this and not just look at the number of years, but actually look into the miles, look into the type of miles, look into how it informs what you can do. Hence, there's this movement away from what is your experience, what have you done, to capacities and strengths. What has your experience informed you? How has it informed your capabilities? This means you'll be more likely asked questions like, how would you handle a situation? Now, the famous example is McKinsey's hiring process, where they ask the question, how many windows are there in New York City? And that's the kind of simulation test that's not designed to reveal that you've already done that problem. You've already solved that mathematical problem. It reveals how you approach problems. It reveals how your experience informs what you can do, could do, or might do, which is ultimately more important. So hidden here is an opportunity. And I think the challenge for a lot of people, it takes a courage to source language, source inspiration within. But when we talk about experience being an opportunity, I think the opportunity is to see more in what we've done, to see more in what we're currently doing, and develop a perceptive ability that lends itself to analogy making and the translation process that's required for us to move from one thing and develop skill in one area and translate it to skill in a new area, a new job, a new position, or perhaps a higher level of performance in an existing one. So I've been alluding to this notion of compelling for some time, and I think it's important at this point that we just speak to a few points about what influence actually looks like. Now, for those of you who are deeply interested in the subject, I recommend Robert Cialdini's books entitled Influence. And there you'll learn tactical maneuvers. However, I'd like to impress upon you the idea that there's more than just linguistic techniques involved, that there's a felt experience. Most of you have probably heard the idea that, I guess the percentage changes, 90-some% of communication is all nonverbal. Well, what we're talking about here is the felt experience of confidence, of competence. And I think on some level, when you're capable of using your own language, when you are describing experiences you've had in ways that it is clearly meaningful and valuable to you, that is actually felt. Now, I think it's the next slide. And this is a truth, the idea that what's compelling to you is not necessarily compelling to me. However, if you don't find it compelling, I won't either. If you don't see the relevance of your experience, then I probably won't either, and not only just see it, but feel it as I'm talking to you. So you've probably all had the experience of being with somebody whose experience excites you, who when they speak from experience, you actually feel the sense of confidence and competence, and you're willing to lend your trust. My suggestion is that they are not borrowing language, that they have actually come up with a way of describing their experiences in such a way as they're relevant. So in summary, before we get into some of the principles and the work involved, the idea here is that you stop on some level borrowing wisdom. This doesn't mean that you don't quote and you don't read. It just means that that has to be balanced with a way of talking about what you've done that inspires you and touches you, of course with the hope that it can then be felt by others. So try speaking from experience and using your own words. How would you describe it? So in the same way, when I first got into leadership coaching, I had to come up with my own way of talking about leadership. I went through the same kind of process. How would I define it? Okay, I've taken some courses, I've read some books, and I understand how others define it. What do I think it is? And in doing so, capturing my own language about it, maybe slight variations on the experts, and discovering a way of connecting with people that's very compelling. So it turns out there's an art to finding your language. When I was in graduate school, I was surrounded by extremely talented people, and I had gone to graduate school specifically with the intention of finding business partners. So I was evaluating how people presented themselves. And on a spectrum, at one end of the spectrum is this self-deprecating kind of Eeyore, I'm not qualified, I'm not good enough. And on the other end of the spectrum, this self-aggrandizing, full of themselves, perhaps dishonest. Somewhere in the middle, there's this calm, assured, compelling, courageous, and creative way of talking about our skills that is honest. It doesn't presuppose the notion that we don't have anywhere to go or any way to grow. However, it honors what we've done as meaningful and valuable. And I think that where we are on this spectrum is very personal. So the idea here, though, is that it's not an invitation to spin. When we look into our experiences and try to articulate the value in different ways, it's not about exaggerating, it's not about spin, and it's certainly not about one end of the spectrum self-deprecating that they lack value and not overblowing it on the other end of the spectrum, but finding that place in the middle where we can speak confidently and competently to what we can do. So this is an interesting thing and it deserves a longer discussion. How do you know you're there with your language? Well, the reality is your feeling sense will be your barometer. In some cases, we say your body is your barometer. In doing this, in trying language and practicing talking about your experiences, you'll find words that resonate with you. You'll start to discover what it feels like to say something that you truly mean, that is informed by experience. You'll discover what it's like to agree with an idea, to resonate with someone. And when you discover that, that will be the signal that you're landing on language that you want to start evolving into the way you talk about yourself. As an aside, I think it's important to note that the skill will support you as you investigate your passions and evaluate opportunities. You'll start to look for that feeling of resonance with the people you interact with, the companies you seek out, and hopefully many of you were able to attend last week's lecture by Kathy, and you've actually engaged some of these processes. If you can start to feel into those exercises, you'll get a lot more out of them. So the question here is, what are you rehearsing? I have never liked the notion of an elevator pitch. I feel like I can tell when somebody is stating something that's rehearsed and it feels forced. So the question here is, what are you rehearsing? Are you rehearsing a story in the sense that you're memorizing it? I don't think so. I think what you're rehearsing is access to this language set, access to this feeling sense. So while some language will be repeated, for example, you'll discover ways of talking about certain experiences that resonate with you and feel right, you'll keep some of that language and yet get away from the notion of rehearsed in the sense of memorized. And what you'll be rehearsing is a way of opening sort of a channel to this place where what you say is truly compelling. So I don't think it's repetition. And the caveat, of course, is an elevator pitch will likely emerge from this process, meaning you'll likely come up with language, statements that you can make, and you'll find that through doing this, you have an ability to tailor them to context. And I think that's what's different from an elevator pitch, in the sense that you're forcing this idea into a conversation as opposed to speaking elegantly and organically in context. So it's a little bit like a stream of consciousness exercise as you rehearse the process. You'll rehearse that opening of the channel. That's what you're practicing here. So we say rehearse the process and open yourself to the language, not memorize. Okay, so I've been referring this to as the inner work of professional development, and you'll see exactly what I mean. So there are some worksheets that we'll share at the end. This is the kind of exercise that you can do for yourself that can help build this capacity within you. This is the first exercise in a program that I've run for many years now, where you make a list of 101 achievements. Write down 101 achievements, and the idea is you do not stop until you get to 101. Now, I won't give away the whole goose here, but here's the challenge for most people. By the time you get to 20 or 30, you're maxed out, meaning you've written down everything you see as an achievement. Remember, these exercises are designed to get you to stretch your thinking into possibility and to attempt to articulate value in new ways. So the challenge is to get to 101. There's more information on the worksheet. I won't belabor it now, but you can see already how this might stretch you and stretch your capacity to think about what an achievement really is to you. The second exercise is extremely important and points more to the analogy-making function of the brain that we're trying to train here. We call it talents and takeaways. So you would actually use one of the achievements from the first exercise and start to explore what you learned. What talent did it take to actually accomplish it that you already had? And what new talents did you get out of it? And then a further stretch is, who needs this? Now that I'm starting to try to discover talents and takeaways from my even seemingly mundane experiences, what if I discover something and then challenge myself to see how it might be applied? And here is where you find opportunities, possibilities for employment, promotion that you may not have thought of in the past. It's very powerful. And then for extra credit, since Kathy brought up mind mapping last week, please challenge yourself to mind map your talents and takeaways and create a visual picture of your experiences. That can be very powerful as well. There's a free app called Simple Mind in case you're interested. All right. So those are two exercises that will get you started. This next process is the process that I would encourage you to adopt and never stop, basically ever throughout your professional career. The fundamentals of the process will stay the same, even though the output may look different at the beginning of your career, mid-career, etc. You'll find that this process is what actually trains you. So I'm going to skip this and jump right to the graphic here. The idea here is that we become things, that we start off in life and we become different things. So each one of these lines are my identities. These are the roles that I play. I might put something like leadership coach. I might put father. I might put martial artist. I might put musician. I might put, whatever I see myself as, that I become these things. The problem is they don't seem related. So being a father has nothing to do with being a leadership coach. Being a musician has nothing to do with being a martial artist. Whatever it is, now these are my hobbies and interests. Whatever I define myself as seems compartmentalized. It feels like they're unrelated, and therefore it's an exhausting life. We call it the compartmentalized life. What if we were to start to put some downward pressure on that? Well, what if we were to take those same identities and through analogy making discover how they're related and challenge ourselves in this way? If I were to become a better father, how would that make me a better leadership coach? If I were to become a better musician, how would that make me a better leadership coach? In the same way, I might put geologist here. How has that made me who I am today? And as we discover the interconnectedness, we wind up in this very dynamic place where all of a sudden these seemingly compartmentalized notions that we've created about ourselves are not so compartmentalized. This allows one area of my life to inform another. And when we get to this place, the way we talk about ourselves changes dramatically. So the idea then is that you discover through this analogy making process that your life has added up to something dynamic, something capable, where your potential can be spoken to in context. As a result of this process, you will find ways to use your talents in ways that you have never thought of before. And that's why I say it's so powerful. So whether you're at the beginning of your career or you're at middle or even later stage where you're thinking about meaning making, I would encourage you to start to look at the ways you describe yourself. Look at the extent to which you see them as compartments in your life. Feel into how unrelated they feel, and then flip that on its head by discovering exactly what it is that unifies them, exactly what it is that makes all of the things that you do, all of the ways that you self-identify as being one dynamic creation, one pathway that's led you to a capacity you didn't know you had before. So this question, this notion of searching for what unifies, this is the theme. Remember, we're trained to find differences right from the beginning. Every test we took in grade school what was marked red was what was wrong, not what was right. And so we're all hyper-focused on the differences between these things. And as you can see, the theme here is, what do these seemingly different roles have in common? What does my current situation and the life I want, what does it have in common? What am I bringing with me? So answering this question yields insights. We start to think more creatively about our capacities, who we can serve, what we can do with this life. It's all about analogy making. And for those of you who are interested, I meant to include a video clip here. Douglas Hofstadter wrote the book on analogy making as the core of cognition. I strongly encourage you to investigate him. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Apollo 13. Ed Harris's character at some point says, "I don't care what it was designed to do, I care what it can do." And that's exactly what we're getting at here. I'm not interested in the labels, the titles I've had before. I'm interested in digging deeper into those experiences to discover what they actually mean for me, what potential they create for me, and what opportunities do they open. So here are some recommendations. One of the most valuable things I've ever done is to use a voice recorder. Every smartphone in the world now has one on it. Record your voice and listen to it. Start to describe some of these experiences that you're looking to make relevant. Listen to your voice. The overt part of the process is that you'll refine your language. You'll discover things that you say, words that you want to keep using, perhaps even an elevator pitch. However, the real value is in listening to your own voice and getting comfortable with it. For many people, this is a challenge. Most people at the outset do not like the sound of their own voice. And when they get excited, for example, versus when they're drained, these things become obvious. So I highly recommend you actually practice talking about your experiences out loud into a voice recorder and actually playing them back. The second thing is dedicate time for this. Now, this does not need to be a sit-down homework assignment. This can be the kind of thing you do on your morning commute. However, it is time that if you focus on it will be more valuable. So if you close your eyes on the train into town and you actually ask yourself, how is something I've done in the past? Maybe something seemingly unrelated. How is it relevant to what I'm capable of now? How is it relevant to the next meeting I'll be attending? If you can, journal these thoughts and ideas, because that language, if you see it in the same way that hearing your own voice, as you start to see it on paper, you'll find language that's really useful for things like resumes and cover letters. And then perhaps what is resisted most by my clients who I lead through this process is to practice writing your bio. Now, I don't mean editing your bio. The idea here is that you will, from scratch, write it and speak it. Remember, you're not rehearsing and memorizing language. You're attempting to access that muscle, that channel in which you can express yourself in the most compelling manner. So every day for a week, say it out loud a few times in the shower or as you're walking around. Practice writing it from scratch as if you were being introduced as a presenter, for example. And just start. Or perhaps take an experience you have and try writing about it from scratch. Try talking about it from scratch as if you're being asked a question. I guarantee as a result of that process that your interviewing skills will go through the roof. All right, so we're wrapping up here and we're on time, so I'll have plenty of time to answer questions. So this is the career coaching model I've used for many years. You'll see there are these 5 content areas. We will address some of them and have in the last lecture. But you'll see there's a strategy component, an expression component, compatibility, fulfillment, and relevance. What these are is listed here. Fulfillment, the idea of passions, purpose, and values. Compatibility, your needs and culture fit requirements. The strategy you'll actually implement to find the job. And how you express yourself in person, on paper, and online. In my experience, if you focus on this relevance process, you will actually solve many of these. Because as you begin to walk into your day with a more compelling and articulate way of talking about what you can do, you will find, for example, networking becomes much easier. Strategies will present themselves. You'll start to use language in person, on paper, and online that is more compelling to you and more compelling to others. That speaks more accurately to your uniqueness and value. As an aside, I thought I actually had a slide on it. I'd like to just make a point about resume writers. Great resume writers will spend some time with you to discover this language. If you use a resume writer who is only going to use keywords or resume writing best practices, there's a bit of a risk involved. And that is that your resume will wind up looking like everybody else's. So as you start to discover language that means something to you, be sure to marry that with the language that all of the search engines are looking to find. So that's just one caveat. If you can find a resume writer who will actually spend time with you to actually get some of this language from you, then you're better off. All right. So as I said before, this is the common thread. Wherever I see people in their career, this is the prerequisite for success that I see. That at some point, whether you're an introvert or extrovert, you'll have to learn to speak about yourself in a compelling manner. To do this, you might actually have to look at yourself in a different way. You might actually have to spend some time mining seemingly mundane experiences for meaning and value. I think the ultimate goal is not just to look backward, but to engage our experience in such a way as to inform potential, so that every experience we engage in becomes an opportunity for growth, becomes an opportunity for enhanced capacity, opens possibility. So one of the best pieces of advice I ever received was just before I left professional world for graduate school. I was passed over for a promotion, and my mentor, as I was preparing to leave the company, he said, remember, it's your story. Now, just as I said before, this was not an invitation to spin, to exaggerate, to claim experience I didn't have. To me, this was an invitation to decide for myself what my experiences mean to me. Nobody can take away the fact that in a technical manager role, I learned something about conflict resolution. Nobody can tell me otherwise. And I can tell you exactly how I learned it and how it applies or could apply in a new role. That's the power I've developed. It's my story. I get to decide what my experiences mean to me. I get to decide what I learned. As a result of my capacity to make analogy, I can find ways to apply my experiences in ways that might surprise me. Perhaps the confidence that I'm looking for, the opportunity that I'm looking for, is just this creative leap away. So I think with that, we'll close. And Michael, I'm up for questions. I certainly hope this
Well,
has
first
been
off, Daniel,
helpful to you.
first off, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us watching today and those watching the recording in the future. What a great second step to the four-part series that you and Kathy have kindly put together for the William & Mary alumni community. I highly encourage those that are participating today that haven't watched Kathy's to check out the recording. I'll get those up online shortly, or you can just email me directly and I'll make sure you have the link to the recording, as well as today's session. If you missed anything, I will be sending out a recording to all of our registrants, and feel free to share that to your fellow tribe members that you think would find this very valuable. And then hopefully you'll join us again in a few weeks on the 17th for Kathy's second webinar focused on designing the plan. And then Kathy and Daniel will be joining us again a week after that on the 24th for leveraging the network. And so with that, I'm just going to, before I start asking questions, Daniel, I'm going to go ahead and put the worksheets up for those people to download and make sure. I'll keep them up here. And just as a reminder, if you do have questions, please type them in the Q&A box on the right side. I'll get to as many of questions that we have in the next 15 minutes or so. One question that I'm noticing is a little bit of the attendees here today come from all different backgrounds of age level, I would say, and I'm curious as to what you've seen from your clients or dealing with this presentation in other environments, what you would advise somebody that's, say, early on, and as well as mid-career, and even those that may be in a situation where they now have to articulate their experiences in an interview for a position after not being in the job search experience for a while, and how age has a part in some of people's perception of experience, and what you can share on that area.
Yeah, gladly. It's a great question and a common one. So my challenge to you is to find analogy, right? That's what this whole thing is about. So maybe you're using different language. Where you are in your career isn't necessarily firefighter to fire chief. And yet the process is the same, meaning the way you talk about yourself, the way you see what you've done as meaningful and relevant to the next position you're going for. That's the same whether you're at the beginning of your career or mid-career. Now, while you may find it easier to get to 101 achievements if you're mid-career, you won't get to 101, I guarantee that. You'll be forced to stretch. You'll be forced to stretch in the way we're sort of talking about. The other point is this: as you are probably all aware, if you do not feel you are qualified, I will feel it too. So if you're going to an interview, if you're applying for a job and you have language that says that you don't have the experience or that you don't feel qualified, there's a very high likelihood that not only will that be felt, but it will actually come out in your resume. It will actually come out in your cover letter subtly, almost as like an intuition. So the notion of preparing yourself to talk about your experiences is relevant wherever you are in your career path for that very reason. I would argue that as if you are earlier in your career, the types of experiences you'll be mining for value will look different. However, they will be no less valuable. And if you can stretch even a little bit into some creative way of talking about how it informs who you are, how it informs what you can do for a company, you'll be just as well off as somebody mid-career who's looking to make a transition, or sell somebody on the idea that what they've done in the past will actually help them succeed in a new role. So I hope that answers your question.
No, I thought it definitely addresses that question and helps all of us, articulate better, the different areas that we are currently in as far as our where we are in our career. Um, one thing that one of our attendees was wondering is how you would recommend using these techniques to help somebody identify what you want to do. And some of us, participating may know it's time to make a transition, but aren't quite sure who and what we want to be next. How would you advise somebody in that situation?
In this sense, I think this content fits very well with the passion exercises that Kathy shared last week. As you look to your experiences, you'll discover things you didn't notice about them, perhaps things that went overlooked. There's a feeling quality to these things. So if you are looking to decide whether or not this next move is right for you, tuning into yourself in this way can be extremely helpful. Looking back on past experiences and asking questions like Kathy posed: what energized me about it? What am I overlooking? Can I stretch my thinking so that I see this experience as different? Perhaps I'll discover, for example, that I really enjoyed an activity a lot more than I think I did. Or maybe I didn't enjoy it as much as I think I did. But I think as you're trying to discover things about yourself, this is where the past really meets the future. It really helps in this sense to start to practice talking about these things internally and externally and on paper so that you might actually discover exactly what it is you want. I think that I think that these work very well together.
Great. We're getting wonderful questions, so keep them up, and I'll do my best to ask Daniel in the next 10 minutes all of these. One question that an attendee has is, if we're in a place where we're unsure of what we want, is it putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, to look for job roles and see if they resonate with us? Or would you recommend waiting to look at job postings until we've actually identified a key set of skills we have that are reflected in our story?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as long as you're not waiting for perfect, then it can work. I mean, as long as you're not waiting for a perfect sense of what that opportunity should look like, or a perfect sense of what my experiences empower me to do, my feeling is that this should be 50% of your ongoing professional development process. It doesn't excuse you from strategizing. It doesn't excuse you from looking at what fulfills you in terms of passions and opportunities. I think these things really go on concurrently. So as we develop our perceptive abilities into things we've done, perhaps things we're currently doing, we can then very easily translate using visualization and imagination to what we might do with them, and then start to evaluate opportunities based on a better benchmark. I think before career coaching, for example, a lot of people are kind of falling forward in life. They're taking the next position because it makes sense. On some practical level, I completely understand. They're taking the next role because it's more money, because it's a better title, because it's a more interesting company, whatever it is. This kind of process is the process by which you get really intentional about this. So that the next move you make is in better alignment with who you are, what you value, what you can do, and what fulfills you than any move you've made in the past.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to take a quick moment here just to launch in everyone's computer survey. Hopefully between now and your next activity this afternoon, you can take a quick minute or two just to complete this. This will help me in planning future webinars and get a sense as to what your needs are as attendees. If you're watching the recording, please do complete the survey as well. It's good for future programming and plans for all of the career and professional programs we are doing for William & Mary alumni. Back to questions. Daniel, when you don't necessarily have the benefit of speaking to a talent manager or resume coach, how do you move beyond just the job titles that people regard lowly? This individual currently is titled administrative assistant, and their role goes well beyond that, and their experiences extend beyond that as well. So just curious how you would advise somebody in this situation.
Well, I think part of the issue for people is that the title has a magnetism to it. It tends to capture a lot of our attention, and we jump to assumptions we make about what that actually means, what administrative assistant actually means. I think the notion of digging deeper is digging into the competencies that you're developing. What you'll find is that in any managerial role, for example, all of the skills that you're developing as an administrative assistant are required. They will be leveraged to some extent. And so seeing that translatability is all that I'm really encouraging you to do. Letting go of whatever inclination we have to focus only on the title, to dig a little bit more into the roles, responsibilities, what your actual day looks like, and the kinds of skills you'll need to actually succeed in that role. That's where I'm coming from.
Great advice. What do you think? What is your thoughts on when people hear I'm too, or they say I'm overqualified for this position, or in interview outcomes, and that term overqualified? What would you advise somebody to address their job search or career transition when they are looking for positions, and either they themselves think they're overqualified, or the employer is concerned that this person might be overqualified?
I mean, this is an issue. I think that it's not about dumbing down your experiences or dumbing down your resume. And sometimes we have 20 years experience and we're applying for a job that requires 8. And we may need to make adjustments to our resume or the way we present ourselves. If we truly feel it's a good fit, then what we want is for that feeling of fit, that feeling of I'm capable and the right person for this job, to come out in our language. So the purpose of this process would be to reveal exactly the right language for that opportunity. So you may need to adjust the way you talk about yourself. And it doesn't mean playing down certain things necessarily. It may just involve focus on different aspects of your experiences or an explanation. A lot of people use cover letters for this very reason, to explain, for example, why they're making a move geographically, or to explain why it is they're applying for a job that maybe they're on the surface look overqualified for. I mean, there's no doubt that there's an issue here. I would encourage anybody who's facing this to look at overall fit and speak to that.
Great advice, and one that I know a lot of people that I've reached out to me, alumni, that is oftentimes some questions that we get from our community. Another segment of our community are those in the military, and we have a lot of alumni that have ventured into the military, and we're grateful for them. And I'm curious, when they transitioned into civilian positions, this topic of experience is really, sometimes a very key, important part of articulating their military experiences in a way that is common if the employer is not one of the employers that traditionally hires a lot of military. And how can you advise somebody? Are there resources that you recommend, or quick advice here in the last few minutes that might be grateful for those in that community?
Well, I would just say this. You've developed the skills that every employer wants, those so-called soft skills, which I don't think are really soft anymore. Your perseverance, your resilience, your capacity to adapt. These are all hidden qualities that may not present themselves in a job description or an offer. However, do not discount the value of those. how a quick study you are in all sorts of areas of activity, how your perseverance and will can overcome basically any credential challenge. Now, it is true that you may need to start somewhere and prove yourself in those cases where the companies aren't in the habit of hiring these people. But listen, do not discount the value you bring. I cannot tell you how rare these skills are, how over-focused the world is on skills that are not, let's say, long-term skills. And I simply would encourage you to really go for it, to speak to your adaptability, to speak to how you, what you've developed, the skills you've developed in the military will translate to an excellent, outstanding employee. There is a very good reason, by the way, that ex-military succeed in management roles. There are very good reasons for that. And so getting in the door, I can recognize that as a challenge. However, I'm a fan, and I know a lot of people are fans of the skills that veterans develop.
Great, I agree. Wonderful advice. Another segment of our community are those that either mother or father that stayed home to help raise a family, a child or many children. And this particular participant today, is curious whether the volunteer experiences are key to include in this process that you presented today. You mentioned a bit of that in your own list of what makes you, and would you agree? And then, addressing this, say, 10 to 15 year gap that many people have because of staying home with family, and how can you advise somebody in that scenario to address the experiences that are relevant?
Great question, very, very common challenge. And here's the deal. You will have to speak to those experiences that have kept you sharp. So volunteer experiences absolutely fall into this category. Here's the deeper challenge. I have found a lot of commonalities between family dynamics and work dynamics. And for me, being informed in one area and being able to navigate emotional terrain has informed my ability to run meetings and manage teams. Now, I know that may seem like a leap to people, but that is exactly the leap that I'm describing. So you have to figure out in your own way how you've stayed sharp. And volunteer experiences, there's probably not a better, more easily accessible example for people, but don't let that stop you from actually attempting to translate in your mind how the role you've played over the last 10, 15 years could make you valuable to someone else. And challenge yourself to think creatively about that.
Great. I have two more questions if we can fit them in the next few minutes. The first one is, what about a complete career change? And I mean, I think I know your answer to this one, but I'm going to let you respond to this participant, because I think that every change has a connection is what you're probably going to suggest, and that, complete career change is still just another experience. But I'm curious your thoughts on this one.
Well, what is a complete career change? And are you the victim of just focusing on the title or the industry? And have you made assumptions about what that change actually means? And I think part of it is true, and part of it will require that you actually seek some common ground. And you'll find that, with rare exception, there's a lot that you can bring from one industry to another, and whole schools of thought, by the way, about value and creativity in this domain.
Great. And with the last question, again, I'll send out this survey link, the recording link, the worksheets, and a reminder for the next webinar on the 17th, same time of the day. The last question I'm going to leave everyone with is, how would you recommend, for those that actually manage employees, or supervise, I should say, how to help support this for your employees? How can you encourage this type of thinking with your team to give them the confidence, to give them the feeling as a manager that this person knows that I need to continue to grow my career and my experiences? What would you advise somebody in that role?
I think it's a great question, and there are two two pieces to this. One is a discovery of value and experience as a platform for identifying developmental opportunities. So as a way of looking backward to kind of establish where we are and what our actual competencies are. So I would encourage having this inner dialogue. I would encourage sharing these kinds of worksheets and these questions with people and as part of team building activities, as part of performance reviews, that kind of thing. The second area has to do with what you do with training. So for example, if you have staff that's applying for a training opportunity, challenge them to articulate in a more meaningful way or in a deeper way what that training is supposed to do for them. And I think follow-on questions like, how are you going to use this? How are you going to ensure that your experience in this training opportunity is not lost as soon as you come back to daily life? And I think those kinds of questions will help clarify not only in people's minds why they need it and the justification, but ensuring that value is actually received and returned from those experiences.
Well, with that, I say thank you very much, Daniel, for your time today in preparation to do today's webinar. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise. We are excited to have you back in just a few weeks with Kathy to discuss networking and how to best utilize everything that our participants do today and the worksheets you provided and with the passion worksheets that Kathy provided, and then design their plan, how to best utilize this William & Mary network and other communities and affinities that they align with to build success for their career interests. But I want to say thank you again, and hope all of you will join us again in take a little week off and do all the worksheets that both Kathy and Daniel have supplied you. And we look forward to having you join us again. Daniel, thank you so much, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you all. It's an honor to support the William & Mary community.
Go Tribe.